lecture. Everything okay so far? Wonderful. I appreciate that. Sorry, I just have to put it a bit like that. And I don't need this one. Okay. What are we dealing with today under the headline of make or buy decisions? Of course, we first have to, again, as usually, we have to define what is it about, make or buy. I mean, it's pretty trivial. You will have your first associations, your first ideas about that. What is the make or buy decision in the public sector context or in public organizations? My third point, and that is a more important point, I would say, is I would like to develop together with you something like a general framework for make or buy decisions. So what are the steps, how we are executing such decisions, what are the basic criteria, which is the next point, the criteria for make or buy decisions. And at the end, I will give you some smell on a topic which we are dealing next week at Monday, institutional options or institutional choices, and of course some more theoretical reflections which are in the background of that issue. So you see, it's a rather compact, not too heavy issue today. I'm pretty confident that you will survive today and get the major messages of this topic. And at the end, as I already announced, we will have some discussion and some questions. And a nice reminder from our tutor, be aware, that's something like a little, it's not a warning signal, it's more, let's say, a motivating signal for you. In the last of the 4 sessions I am responsible for in October, in that course, in session number 9, which will be next Thursday, so next Wednesday. I always mix a bit with the master program. Next Wednesday, while we are dealing with performance measurement and performance management, I just now announced we will present to you a little case study from, by the way, from South Africa, from one of our partner universities, Stellenbosch, which probably gives you some better understanding of what performance management and performance reporting, that's a case study particularly about, is dealing with. Okay, that's it. The make or buy decision is a very simple, very trivial thing at the first glance. I'm sure everybody of you every day from morning to evening is doing a lot of make or buy decisions. Should you have your own breakfast in the morning, or should you go in the next cafeteria? Should you cook your lunch or dinner in your own cuisine if you have something like that, or should you go in a nice little restaurant? Should you wash your shirts or something like that for your own, or do you contract it out to an external provider, etc., etc.? You know, it's a lot of very simple cases where you every day are raising and deciding on this make or buy issue. So it's very usually, and it's on the first glance really simple. Should an individual like you or me or an organization, of course we are more in the organizational context here, produce a certain product should also, or may also mean a service, with own means and capacities, so we may call that self-production, production with our own means, or should the product or service be purchased from an external producer or provider? From our perspective, that means we are contracting out. No? We are setting up a contract with another external provider, a company, whatever, no? A restaurant, in some of the cases we mentioned already. So we are contracting out the respective good or service. We don't produce it ourselves. We are contracting out. I have already mentioned very simple examples of make or buy in the daily life. I'm sure you are aware of that. Let's have a look in the industry sector, in the private business sector. I'm not sure whether you have dealt with make or buy decisions in generic management somewhere. It's one of the very usual, also very important topics of management, make or buy. It's nothing new. Every manager has to decide on make or buy since ever. Probably why we are dealing here with this topic is it is to some extent new for the public sector, or maybe not the issue itself, but the view on the problem is new, and the economic and managerial explanation maybe also to some extent new. So imagine, just to give you some ideas, make or buy decisions have been and still are very, very prominent and important in, for instance, in the automotive industry, car factories. It's has been one of the big issues. Just to, maybe you have dealt with that in one of your management lessons. You may know the famous MIT study of the late 80s. The Americans realized that the Japanese companies, you know, all them, these Toyotas and Nissan and Mitsubishi and Honda and so on, they have been much more productive and much more efficient compared with General Motors or Chrysler or Ford. And they try to identify why have they been so much more efficient, and one of the, amongst other reasons, one of the arguments of the Japanese automotive industry was a much lower degree of self-production. So Toyota, all the others are much more contracting out to suppliers, to entrepreneurs, which are delivering most of the parts and of the essential elements of the car, and that in the late 80s this was an interesting and very challenging exercise for the American industry. You will probably know to some extent they have solved the problem. They still have problems in surviving with their cars against the Japanese competition. However, in most of the Western countries, also it's the same case with Fiat or one of the other Italian companies, or with the German ones like Volkswagen or Mercedes or BMW. The degree of self-production, the vertical integration, have been reduced in the last 10-20 years, and nowadays the degree is maybe somewhere around, in average, 20 or 25%. One of the maybe most interesting example is the smart production. You may know the smart cars are produced somewhere in France, not so far away from the German border, in Lotharing, Lorraine, I think it's a French word, I'm not sure about that, and they have extremely reduced the degree of self-production. I just read some articles that the degree is somewhere around 1 or 2%. So every single part, every piece of the car is produced by external providers. The only entrepreneurial effort or activity of this very tiny smart company is just to have the idea, you know, to have this nice. I'm not sure whether it's nice, but the idea of constructing a very small, very short car with only 2 seats, which is in traffic jams like the Milanese case probably quite suitable, and to do the marketing. Everything is produced by external there's not the assembly line is smart, owned by the smart company. Imagine, it's a bit a crazy story, and it gives you maybe the idea of a very extreme way of contracting out. Everything is buy, nothing more is make. If you look more deeply in the private sector, in issues which are usually contracted out, we have one important term which is also relevant for public sector. That's the term of core tasks or core competencies. You probably have learned that in other managerial lectures. Companies, and I would add public sector organizations, they should really rely on core competencies. They have to ask very strongly which are our core competencies, where are we strong, which are our core tasks, and they should contract out, should get rid of all the many non-core competencies and tasks. You see some examples here, like office cleaning or IT services or tax administration, some of these, let's say, typical supportive and administrative tasks. It usually would be advisable to contract them out because they are not related to the core competences of that business. So, as I already told you, the trend in industry and also in the service sector in the last let's say 20 years, something like that, 25 years, have been the reduction of the degree of self-production, a clear trend towards outsourcing, and that happened all under the umbrella of what the Japanese, but also the Americans called the lean management or lean production movement, starting with in the late 80s and having been very important in the 90s of the last century. Interestingly, just as a very short information, in the last 2 or 3 years, the pendulum is swinging back, interestingly. A lot of companies, I only know some examples from Germany, or a few also of the United States. A lot of companies have discovered that, well, extreme outsourcing or contracting out is sometimes too costly, sometimes strategically dangerous. We will come back to that in a few minutes. And thus, large industries are nowadays deciding to roll back outsourced activities and functions in their own businesses because they discovered, well, it might be more efficient, maybe also more strategically important to have influence on the major activities. So, interesting development. After 20 years of a strong emphasis on contracting out, now the contrary is beginning, and it might be for you as young future managers be interesting to just to have a look on that development. Is it continuing to swing back, to reduce the or to enlarge the self-production degree, or is it just a short development? Okay, after that small introduction into the private sector, we should, of course, in that session on public management, deal with the public sector. Very generally, I would say, in the public sector, we have more or less the same problems and the same challenges. With make or buy, we have to raise the same issue. Should we produce a certain service for our own, or should we contract the service out to external providers. There are not many differences, but of course there are some differences. Otherwise we could just skip it out of the session. If we look back, we may say in the last 40, 50 years, we had usually in most European states a relatively high level of self-production. That depends on the model of what we call the welfare state. You know, particularly the Nordic countries, the Scandinavian countries, but also several of the classical European states over a long time believed in the strong values of the welfare state. And the welfare state understanding was, in the classic sense, the idea of producing services with publicly owned capabilities and know-how and also resources. So over time, if we look back in the last decades, the level of self-production was pretty high in the public service or the public sector. It is now changing in the last, well, I would say maybe something like 10 years. It's a bit depending on the countries. In the Anglo-Saxon world, it started a bit earlier, but usually that debate is relatively new in the public sector, the make or buy debate. So we can say, due to probably two main reasons, fiscal stress, you know, most of our countries, Italy is also a very, very prominent example, or my own country, Germany, another one, are suffering from strong fiscal stress. You know, the Maastricht criteria are one of the big challenges and problems, but also, I would say, the emerging neoliberal doctrines in the last 10, 15 years, or maybe even longer, have been a cause to rethink the whole story of the welfare state and the idea of, or to reflect in a different pattern the make or buy decision. So nowadays, since a couple of years, the degree of self-production has been reduced in most countries and the contracting hours has been increased. Okay, so that was a little introduction. My next point would be to discuss with you some ideas of I would call it a framework of make or buy decision. What was the traditional production model of public administration in the classical context of the welfare state? I would like to introduce to you in this context in a very simple way the idea of the value chain. If you want to deliver and to produce and to deliver a certain good or a service to the citizens, you usually are executing several steps, and these several steps are contributing to the value of that good or services. In a very general sense, we may say we can differentiate between three major steps. The first step, as you see, is goal setting and planning. Imagine a very simple example, public transport, bus services in a metropolitan city like Milano, or tram services or something like that, metro. The first step, if you want to introduce, let's say, a new product or a differentiated product, is always you have to formulate your goals, what are you achieving for, and you have to plan the whole story, very simply. You have to plan the routes of the buses or the trams, you have to plan the schedules and some financial planning, manpower planning, etc. Or, you know, you have to do all the planning work. After having done that, the major, very broadly formulated next step will be the production. Of course, you are producing the service. Buses are driving and transporting, hopefully, passengers to their destinations. Trams are producing services, etc. So the production is running and the services are executed. And furthermore, we should have a third general element in our production model in the value chain. We have to do some monitoring and some evaluation. For instance, are the citizens satisfied? Is the monetary balance somehow adequate? Do we earn enough profits or at least revenues from the new service? Are the buses or trams going on time, etc.? You know, a lot of monitoring issues are related to this point. So what we can say very simply, the classical traditional perception of production in the public sector was like that. You see, was, oh sorry, that is, I'm sorry about that. I forgot to switch it out. I hope it won't never be happening again. I have really to switch it out. Sorry. So it is like this. The public sector is responsible and has influence on every of the elements of this value chain. He is responsible, he is doing and executing all the necessary functions in the first element, goal setting and planning, in the second element, production, and in the third element, monitoring and evaluation. This is a classical, let's say the old version of the production model. Let's have a look on the new, or let's say new in the sense of the current and actual framework and production model. Again, you have these three different broad elements of the value chain, but if you just follow these two different ways through the value chain, there are very different modes and mixes possible now. Just imagine, A is just a symbol, just one pattern how the responsibilities and the tasks can be arranged and distributed. I will give you some examples in a minute. For instance, planning can be done, or goal setting can be done and should be done by the public authority. Planning probably can also be done by a private engineering consultancy office. It must not be done by a public office or a public authority. Production, again, can either be done and executed by public and or private providers, depending on who has a more efficient equipment and offers more reasonable cost calculations, etc. Monitoring and evaluation probably will be, there would be a lot of arguments that they should stay with the public authority, so there wouldn't be much reason to contract them out. Partly maybe it might be possible to contract out certain activities of monitoring. For instance, quality surveys could be done by a private market research company. as a supplier of a public authority. So the picture wants to demonstrate you there are very different patterns and paths through the value chain. There could be a very different mix of public and private execution of certain elements of the value chain. I think we have touched that more or less. So once again, and that is related, you know, with question number 1 I raised at the beginning of this session. Imagine, and you will get an example in well, let's say in some minutes. Imagine if you look for a certain task like public transport, education, cultural activities, or healthcare, or whatever. Imagine there is a certain value chain consisting of different steps or elements, usually much more than just the only one value or the 3 value elements in that chain. So usually there are maybe 10 or 12 or 15. We will come back to that later if we go to practical examples. And we have to look into each of the elements, and we have to ask the make or buy question in each of the elements. For instance, once again, planning. Should it be done by our own means, by our own planning offices? Should it be done by private providers or by other public providers? It's another solution. Production, same question. Monitoring and evaluation, the same question. So, the message is already hopefully clear for you. Have a look on the whole value chain with all the different elements, but also have a look on each of the single elements of that value chain. And deal with the problem, or let's say the issue of the depth of self-production, or the degree of self-production. How much should we produce for ourselves? How much should we contract out? That's the very simple question. Once again, just to give you an idea, that could be the symbols of a value chain with 6 different elements. And the question would be, well, which of the elements should be contracted out? Which of the elements should be produced with our own means? For instance, if we contract out the first 2 and the last 2, we concentrate only on the 2 elements in the center of that value chain, then we may say, well, that's a relatively small degree or depth of self-production. On the other side, if we decide to do everything for our own and don't contract out any of that elements, then of course we can say, well, that's a real very large depth or high degree of self-production. Simple fact, but I think it's necessary to understand it. One additional point I would like to make before I invite you to look for the criteria of the decision. You know, we still haven't discussed what are the criteria on which we have to decide about make or buy. You should see there's rather a continuum between, on the one side, the pure make decision, so we want to do it on our own, and the pure buy decision, we give a single order to a supplier ordering, I don't know, a certain number of services for 1 month or for 1 week or for something like that. There are several alternatives between these 2 different borderlines of that continuum. I just mentioned one. Instead of contracting out, or instead of producing it alone with our own means and capabilities, we may also decide to collaborate. At least two different options for collaboration are very relevant and also very usual. We can collaborate with private providers, so we can do it together, public-private partnership, that's the abbreviation PPP. We can produce a certain service in collaboration of public and private providers. There are a lot of examples, for instance in healthcare or in social services, where we get involved private, not-for-profit organizations like welfare associations, Caritas or Red Cross or something like that, but also, of course, many examples in other areas of the public sector. Or we can collaborate with other public providers. So that would be, again, PPP, but in another sense, public-public partnership. For instance, imagine rural areas somewhere in Italy or in another country where one municipality is unable to provide a certain service. For instance, certain schools or certain cultural institutions or whatever. Then it would be very appropriate to collaborate, to set up a joint venture or a joint activity to provide that service together with 3 other or 5 or I don't know how many other municipalities. So you see, it's not only make or buy, there are several other options. We can also say, okay, let's do it together with some partners. Very simple story, but should be mentioned. Okay, now it's the question, what are the criteria for decide about make or buy? And now it becomes a little bit, at least we get a little smell of economics. We will have a look into some recent debates of new institutional economics because I want to introduce to you at least 2 or 3 terms which are related with these theoretical developments. This is, you see here, this is a proposal that we should take notice of at least the following 3 criteria which are most important. In the next step you will get an idea about several additional criteria which also could be applicable to the make or buy decision. But the most important criteria, just to give you an overview at first, later on I would like to give you some more details to each of these 3 criteria. The first is strategic relevance. So, if we want to decide about make or buy, should we do it ourselves, should we contract it out? You know the story already sufficiently. The first criteria we should discuss or we should look upon is strategic relevance. How strategically relevant is a certain service or product or function? Just to give you a very first idea, what would you say? Office cleaning in a very usual municipality. Is it strategically very relevant, highly relevant? Which organization or which company or which persons are doing that service? Would you say yes or no? I get some no, and you are right, because it doesn't matter very much. There may be some few exceptions, probably in the Ministry of Defense or something like that. It might be to some extent strategically relevant, because if somebody is going through these very secret services and looking for secret documents, that might be a problem. But usually in a very normal situation in a city administration, something like that. It doesn't matter for your strategical survival whether the office cleaning is done by your own cleaning services or by a contracted private company doing the job. So, however, we will discuss some more higher strategically relevant issues in a few minutes. So, strategic relevance. I hope you have got it. You have got the idea. The first question is, should we contract it out? Is the strategic relevance, well, adequate for that? Second question, again, that's a term coming from the institutional economics, specificity. I always have some problems because in German we only say Spezifität, which is a little bit simpler in that language. So I always break my tongue. Specificity. Just an information, if you have downloaded these charts 2 or 3 days ago, because I only discovered it today when I went again through the charts that I made this mistake. I took the German wording, specificity, but it is specificity, so be careful. What is specificity of resources? The idea behind it, and again we will come back to that in a minute, the idea behind it is that for certain products or services we need highly specific resources, for instance, highly specially trained personnel or highly specific machinery, instruments, whatever. So specificity means there is a strong focus on a specific task related to some resources. And the issue is we have to look for the specificity of the resources we are employing or using when we are providing a certain service. The third criteria is, of course, at a first glance, very clear, very general. Everybody of you knows it. Efficiency, usually defined as relation of inputs to outputs or other way around. In any of the different versions, the efficiency, of course, should play a role in our decision on make or buy. Probably everybody of you would have mentioned that at first glance. We contract out. If it's more efficient, we do it ourselves if it's more efficient. Now that's the first glance, it's very simple, but you will see it's not as simple if you look a bit more deeply into that story. So once again, 3 major criteria: strategic relevance, specificity, and efficiency should be looked upon. However, there is a bulk of different additional criteria. I would like to mention at least these 5 different criteria, which I have borrowed from a colleague of mine in Switzerland. I don't want to go into each of these 5 criteria, but I think they are more or less self-explanatory. Of course, the quality plays a role. Just remember the question of office cleaning. Maybe a different quality if you contract it out or if you do it for your own. So quality plays a role. Synergies might also be an important aspect. Synergies means you have, if you do it your own, you can use this service also, or the production of that services for other connected services or products. So there might be synergetic effects. Maybe also sometimes motivational effects to the employees can play a role. I don't go into details of that. Let's have a look in the three more important criteria. Strategic relevance. You find something like a, well, definition or a description of what we understand of strategic relevance. Strategic relevance in the public sector, and I think there's not a big difference to the private sector, is meaning a service is strategically relevant if it determines central political goals of the state. Remember, office cleaning, our nice little story, it's not determining in any way usually central political goals of the state. However, if you look on functions or on services like defense, police services, all these security issues, or foreign policies, for instance, something like that, probably the contracting out issue, the make or buy issue, is of a different strategic relevance. So let's discuss that in our practical debates at the end of the session. We hopefully will come to some results. What does it mean, the impact on important or central political goals? It means that political, a certain task must still be steerable, must still be influenced by the state or by the state authorities. So a strategic relevant task must also be influenced by state authorities, by government, etc., even if it is contracted out. So you see, the message would be, if it is strategically relevant, you must have an influence on this task under every circumstance, in the make or in the buy situation. Therefore, we usually assume that if a certain task or service is of high strategic relevance, it is better not to contract it out, but to do it for our own. Because the assumption is, if we do it our own, we are more able to influence it, we are more able to steer that service and to have influence in it. Other way around, a service like office cleaning, where the strategic relevance is low, we can easily contract it out, ceteris paribus, of course, so only if the other criteria apply. If the strategic relevance is not high, it doesn't play a role. So we can decide make or buy, that doesn't matter. So that is the message for the first criteria of strategic relevance. I hope it is somehow clear for you. Let's have a look on the specificity. What does it mean again? Specificity means the resources related to a certain task or service are highly specific. They can only be used for that specific purpose and not for another purpose. Just to give you a very simple example, if you have let's say a water pipeline in a city, providing water to the citizens, if you have constructed and implemented that a water pipeline, you can only use it for water transport, probably not for gas or oil or something other. It's just for this only single purpose. It's a single purpose investment. You cannot use it for another purpose. Therefore, if you would say, okay, we are contracting out water supply to a private provider, you will face the problem that this specific resource, the already existing water pipeline, Sometimes it's many, many hundreds or thousands of kilometers. Imagine the city of Milan, many, probably 10,000 of kilometers, water pipelines underground would be useless, at least if the provider, the new provider, doesn't overtake these investments. If the provider doesn't overtake, they are useless. The economists say these are sunk costs. The costs are away. So you can't make any use of that special investment. Similar example would be highly specially educated personnel, for instance, police services, or let's say certain scientific educations. If you are contracting out a service, you don't need any longer, let's say, a certain function in the police services. Well, what to do with these highly educated people? You can just fire them or send them into retirement. If the new provider doesn't overtake them, then they are, this resource is useless, sunk costs. So again, you see that's just one of the usual economic definitions. A resource is specific if its value decreases when used for other purposes. And we speak then from sunk costs, as I already have introduced to you. Again, there is a probably quite plausible assumption. If the specificity is high, you should rather go for the make option. You should do it for your own, because then you have the power to use the resource and to employ the resource. If the specificity is low, then it doesn't matter. Then you can contract it out, because if the resources are still there, you can use them for other purposes. So that would be one of the stories behind the specificity criteria. I think this criteria is a bit tricky, and you should have a look on that. I think I have already given you some examples. You find them here again. Number 3, efficiency. On the first glance, very simple, as I already mentioned. On the second glance, I think we have to distinguish between two different variants of, let's say, of costs, because costs are the main criteria in the make or buy decision. We have to distinguish on the one side the production costs, or if we are contracting out a certain service, the costs of purchasing that service, the costs we have to pay to the delivering company. That's very clear. I think nobody of you will have any problem with that criteria. But now it comes. On the other side, question number 2, the transaction costs. Imagine if you are contracting out a certain service to an external provider, you have to undertake something what the economists called a transaction. There's a transaction between you and the service deliverer. You have to look for adequate providers, you have to negotiate contracts, you have to make the contract, you have to maintain the contract, you have to monitor the quality, you have probably some debates about quality problems, you may have even some court struggles with your suppliers if they don't deliver on time or bad quality or something like that, etc. So if you are contracting out, you have certain additional costs, and these costs are called by economists transaction costs, the costs of the transaction. economists say transaction costs don't only occur in the case of contracting out, but also in the case of the own production, because even if you are producing your own goods and services in your own authority or in your own organization, there is the need to coordinate and to control and to manage all these production activities. So transaction costs come up in both cases, in the make case as well as in the buy case. However, the assumption is usually in the make option. So if we are doing it ourselves, the transaction costs will be probably lower because we are in a better position to control and to monitor and to organize all this coordination compared with the buy option. So the lesson for you, lesson learned should be in the we have to distinguish between two different variants of costs, the production or the purchasing costs on the one side, the transaction costs on the other side. The assumption is as follows: in the make option, probably the production costs are higher, but the transaction costs are lower. In the buy option, probably the purchasing costs are lower, but the transaction costs are higher. So in the end, we have to calculate, of course, summing up both categories, production plus transaction or purchasing plus transaction, and look for the best solution where the sum of the two variants of costs is minimum. So you understand that idea of the transaction costs? That is an important issue, therefore I raise it as one of the important questions of the day. Usually in private sector, but particularly in public sector, transaction costs are not very visible and are a bit neglected. So usually managers don't care much about the transaction costs. However, they are really important. Sometimes they really play a big role, and we have to, sorry, I'm always blocking a bit the screen. We really have to look for them. Well, I think regards to our time schedule, I would like to skip a bit the next two charts. Just a very short comment on this nice little triangle, which invites you to think about different options, which we have already mentioned a bit, let's say 10 or 15 minutes ago. Basically, in this make or buy context, you have in the public sector as well, the same in the private sector, three different choices. You have the pure make option, that is the H as standing for hierarchy. You can produce the services with your own means in the classical hierarchical structures of an organization. You have another option, the market option, the buy option. You can go to the market and ask for the service which will be then contracted out. And the third option, I mentioned it shortly, but it should be discussed again. Somebody else has the same problem as me. You also have the cooperation option. You don't have only the two options of make or buy, H or M. You also have the C option. You can collaborate with somebody, with several public or private organizations. And just to give you a short idea, but I don't want to go into details now because that will be the story of our next session next Monday. You see, you have on the top you have the self-production, you have different forms of going towards the market. The ultimate option would be to privatize the service forever, not to give it to the private sector. You, as a public sector, don't bother anymore about that, but also contracting out or some other mixed variants of institutions, which I don't want to mention at the moment, are alternatives. Or you go the other way, towards the C option. You look for several, let's say, soft forms of communal cooperation. You set up something like a public cooperative, you look for public-private partnerships, we mentioned that already. So these are some of the options you have. You see, the diagram only wants to show you the different opportunities you have to deal with in the delivery of a public service. You can do it your own in your hierarchy, you can go to the market, ask for external supply, or you can collaborate with third parties to do it together. Well, just very shortly the theoretical background. I mentioned already the transaction costs, so there is a whole theory behind the transaction costs, the so-called transaction cost theory, which is part of the new institutional economics. Oliver Williamson, probably some of you have heard his name, one of the famous American organization theorists and economists, have more or less developed this approach together with some others like Douglas North and several other American researchers. I only want to give you a very short idea about the theoretical question behind that. Williamson, about, was it 20 years ago? I think so, something like 20 years ago, asked himself, why do we have organizations? Why aren't all transactions, remember transactions? Why aren't all transactions organized by markets? There must be an economic reason why we use organizations, companies, like big industrial companies. And his answer was, well, there must be a comparative advantage of organizations. The transaction costs in some cases are lower in organizations compared with market solutions. In other situations, the market will be more cost efficient. So, very simply said, that's the basic theoretical implication of the transaction cost theory developed from Oliver Williamson about 20 years ago on this market versus hierarchy issue. So transaction costs are the element in that context. I don't want to go into details at the moment. Probably all of you, or some of you at least, have heard of another element of the new institutional economics, the so-called agency theory, sometimes also called principal agent theory. Here you get the simple idea. Usually you can distinguish between a principal and an agent. In our case of the make or buy decision, the client who gives the order will be the principal. The supplier, the provider, will be the agent. The agent usually has an information advantage compared with the principal. He knows more about details of the production of a certain service compared with the principal. So the economists say there is an information asymmetry between the principal, in our case the public sector organization making a certain contracting out a service, and the deliverer of that service, the agent who provides the service. And therefore, the agent will try to cheat, or at least to find some tricky solutions to get a better margin and a better profit from his service, and the principal has to control and to supervise the activities of the agent. So a lot of theoretical aspects behind that. I don't touch it. Again, the transaction costs come up in that context. So only to give you a smell of an idea, the principal agent theory is one of the explanatory concepts of behind the make or buy decision, together with the transaction cost theory, which I mentioned before. Well, coming to more or less, well, not the end of the session, but the end of the presentation, I would like to show you one example at the screen, and then discuss with you, let's say, as much time we still will have, a few number of cases. Imagine waste collection in a municipality. I'm sure everybody has at least some minimum understanding. Each of you is throwing your waste into a basket somewhere in your, I don't know, in your close to your apartment, somewhere in the building. How does it work? If you imagine, and now I come back to our issue, value chain. First question: if you try to look for the whole value chain, there will be, at the beginning of such a service, there will be something like technical planning. When should the garbage be collected? How should it be collected? What is the size of these, the collecting elements? What are the technical solutions? How to recycle, or how to ecologically treat these the waste? All these technical planning aspects should be done at first. Then let's say the production process starts. For instance, certain collecting companies will collect the waste from the households, from the buildings. Sometimes I was very impressed that not only in Germany but also in Italy nowadays, at least in the apartment I'm living here close by, a lot of waste separation is with glass and paper and I don't know, many other things is going on. So that you see there must be also some provision of these different separations. The waste must be collected. It must be somehow treated, sorted. It must be stored. Sometimes, usually, one of the modern techniques is burning the waste with all these energy and pollution problems related. Recycling may be an important thing. Remember paper or glass. You have also something like an administrative part of that issue. You have to collect the fees and charges. You have to administer all these different activities. And last but not least, you remember our first production model, you have also to monitor, to coordinate, to supervise all these different activities. So the question would be, if that is the value chain, the value chain from over these 5 different steps or elements of the value chain, well, which element should be contracted out or should be produced by own means? So if we go very fastly through, I think I have to speed up a bit, but it's really I think it's one of the last slides, or it is the last slide. Technical planning. Probably there would be good arguments that the municipality is doing it themselves, technical planning. Some more, let's say, more comprehensive and more complicated technical planning can be done by private engineering companies. Could be possible. Let's say technical planning of a waste burning plant, because that's a real important, difficult, technologically rather ambitious task. That could be done by a private engineering company. Waste collection from households, that could be done, that now you can apply the 3 criteria. Huh? Is it strategically relevant? Are the resources highly specific? Which solution is more efficient? You have to look very detailed in these 3 criteria. I would say waste collection is not really strategically relevant, at least not, let's say, the normal household waste. It may be different in chemical industries. There might be some dangerous aspects sometimes. Specificity, probably not too high, medium. Collecting is a job, everybody can do that. It's different with, let's say, with burning or recycling. That's much more specific equipment to be needed. Efficiency, well, that's a question. I don't know. That's depending on the case. Which is cheaper? Which is the private or the public solution? Probably the public solution might be a bit more expensive, but we have to think of the transaction costs. If you give the whole waste collection to a private provider, we have to monitor the contract and to deal with all these challenges. In the same way, I don't want to go through all the 5 steps. In the same way, we should, if we would do that in practice, we should discuss the other elements. Every time asking, well, strategic relevance, specificity, efficiency with the 2 aspects of production costs on the one side and the important transaction costs on the other side. So let's have after a short look on the readings, but you know that already. Well, you don't know the suggested readings. I have put some more details for you. If somebody of you is really interested in some of the details, you can look in one of these articles here. But don't forget, there are at least 3-4 pages in the textbook of Bouvert-Löffler, chapter 7. Erich is presenting at least some ideas on that. Madam, I would now be ready to, not to close the session, please. We have some minutes.